Good morning and welcome to all our civil servant friends from across the country who have joined us for this second webinar of the series of webinars that the Mission Karmayogi team is bringing to you as part of this National Learning Week. And thank you again for participating in this journey of learning, the journey of lifelong learning, the call given by the Honorable Prime Minister for all of us. We are having exciting webinars lined up in various different topics that's going to be presented to you the next few days. Today is the Indian Knowledge Systems Day, and this is the second of the series of webinars for today. And we are very happy that we have the founder and CEO of Brihat, a very well-known research and teaching organization, which is headed by Raghava Krishna ji, who is an expert in, actually comes from an IT background, expert in game development, learning, and entrepreneurship. But then after his corporate stint, he realized that what he's really passionate about is public policy, and he wanted to engage directly with India's governance needs. So he is also a dean. He was a co-founder of the Dean of Academics at the Rashtam School of Public Leadership. But then later on, he calls himself a lifelong student of Indian knowledge systems. I think every one of us are, because it's an ocean of knowledge for each of us. And he'll be talking to us he'll talk about the global challenges that the world faces from a very Indian civilizational perspective. It's a very fascinating topic because all of us think that anything ancient and the ancient wisdom and understanding the relevance of it, connecting it to today, we really need to have a clear evidential background of how to do it. And Raghav is very good at that. The world is very brittle, fragile. We all hear of the terms VUCA and BANI, and black swan events have become the normative thing for us these days. And there's so much of civilization wisdom in a country. How do you address these modern complex challenges? How do you really face up to it? And how do you have a very simplified toolkit that all of us as civil servants can start applying? So I now hand it over to Raghavji and request him to enlighten us with these perspectives. Thank you again for joining us today, and namaste.
Namaste. Thank you so much, Dr. Balu. Am I audible? Is everyone able to hear me? Okay, thank you. It's a phenomenally inspiring event to see the country's top leadership under the guidance of Honorable Prime Minister talk about learning as a culture. You know, the first time when I heard about Prime Minister back in the first term, talk about cleanliness in public life and talk about the movements that we need to have as civil society. That was an inspiring moment for me personally, that finally we have a Prime Minister who's talking about things that affect each one of us. And my own journey has also been to recognize the importance and criticality of learning and how that is central to all of our public administrative challenges today. So personally, this is an honor, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. I'll be speaking about three things, and I'll begin my presentation shortly. But quickly, to set the context, and this has been a message that we're getting directly from top leadership in the country, that public policy and public administration, although while primarily focused on the domestic affairs, is inextricably linked with what happens in the world. And because we are talking about global futures, we cannot have a public policy that's decoupled from what's happening in the rest of the world, particularly from the External Affairs Minister, Honorable Minister Jaishankar ji. We've been getting this message repeatedly that the life of the average Indian today is impacted by what happens around the world. So there are three components to this that I hope to put forward. One is the complex integral nature of global futures and the link to knowledge systems. We haven't really conceptualized the global future as a function of knowledge systems. And knowledge systems, while in academic disciplines is a known term, formal systems, formal knowledge, in public administration and public policy, this has not been brought out conceptually. So the link between knowledge systems and what happens in the world, and how our worldview affects the decisions that we make, and how in a complex future, all of our decisions are tied to the worldviews that operate at leadership level. And then, of course, what is the case for Indian knowledge system, not just for epistemic diversity, but also the moral and intellectual case for saying that we have a functioning knowledge system that can offer solutions to the world. We've repeatedly seen the call for Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, but that comes from a deep worldview, that comes from a lived experience. And if we are able to conceptualize the models and thoughts and actions that emanate from that, we would have innovative ways of articulating our own challenges, not just for India, but also for the common tide future that all of us have as humanity. So with that, and this is the only advantage any nation can have in the complex future context is the ability to learn faster than the rate of change in the environment. So with that, I'll just begin my presentation. I'll run it for about 40-45 minutes to make some key points. And towards the last 15 minutes, I'll open it up for questions. And of course, in the 1 hour, like Sir said, we only have, it's an ocean and we only have an opportunity to dip our feet into it. But sometimes that is just enough to have a lifetime of inspiration. You're able to see my presentation?
Not yet, I think you'll...
Okay. Please let me know once it is up.
It's just coming up.
Okay.
We can see it now, and you can continue. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you. IKS is the short form for Indian Knowledge Systems. And I'll offer some more information around the content, methods, and institutions that compose what we call the Indian Knowledge Systems. But fundamentally, all of this is lived reality for an ordinary Indian. All of us, when we interact with society and each other, we operate on certain paradigms. And those paradigms, in fact, even though we're not fully conscious of it sometimes, they govern a lot of our behavior and exchange. Formally, this is called Indian Knowledge System. The new education policy allows us to have this conversation, not just as an informal exchange, but also as an academic discipline. And the primary case for Indian knowledge system and the civilizational mind is that it had the ability to harmonize the opposites. When we talk about central principles like dharma is harmonization of the opposite. And the separation between the subject and object, and therefore all the other seemingly opposite and contradictory things. This has been the Indian problem-solving method to reconcile all of the opposites. And this, I think, is the critical knowledge production that needs to happen, because otherwise the world today presents to us a lot of things as binaries, and it limits the scope of our decision making. The Indian tradition, of course, is not new to governance and complexity. In fact, Mahabharata, as it is said about Mahabharata, whatever is there in the world, it is there in Mahabharata, and what is not there in the world. It is simply to say that all of human predicaments, aspirations, anxieties, joys are contained in the archetypes that we get from Mahabharata, and it has a seminal verse, and it's pertinent. And I'm having the privilege of addressing the public leadership of this country now. The sum total of all knowledge is governance. This is the message that we get from Mahabharata. And fundamentally, when you look at managing complex change, and this comes to us from systems theory, we look at 5 components of complex change. You have a vision that is clearly the leadership deliverable, and all of us are having this conversation because there has been a certain vision of Karmayogi set out for us. It needs to be combined with skills. There have to be incentives and culture, and then resources and action plan. This seems to be the design for complex change. And if you can see, any of this is missing, then you will not have the right outcome. If vision is missing, you might have the skills, incentives, resources, and action plan, but it leads to confusion. If you have the vision, but you don't have the skills, and you have the incentives, resources, and action plan, oftentimes, even in public systems, we see that there is an anxiety. This anxiety about change, and especially when we are looking at the rate at which technology is changing things, all of us are having to increase the ability to learning how to learn. And if you're not investing in this, then there is a certain an amount of anxiety. And if the incentives are not tuned for that, then there is resistance. But if you don't have the resources, there is frustration. But if you have all of this, then there is a false start. When I look at Capacity Building Commission, and particularly the mission of Karmayogi and how it's executed, I would say that this is one of those policies and vision execution that actually ticks all the 5 boxes. There is a vision of Karmayogi, there are the skills and the investment in learning. Clearly there's a lot of thought put out into how this learning has to be executed, and the action plan of curating something like a National Learning Week and making learning the central feature. All of this brings us to the question of what it is. It's a complex, changing world, and clearly we are hearing terms like civilization, worldview, ethics. coming into public policy, there's been a very forceful articulation. And this is only natural. 70 years after independence, like all other nations and all other civilizations, identity, stability, and prosperity are the eternal concerns of all people all the time. The question of who we are, the question of how do we come together as a society that's harmonized for purpose, and the question of how do we come together in a productive way to create prosperity for all. This is the quest that India has been, and that's been accelerated in the last 10 years. Therefore, a new articulation of India's identity, which flows into our policy, which flows into our institutions, is beginning to happen. And how do we do this? The how part is the multidisciplinarity and knowledge systems. Therefore, the software that can actually support our ability to increase our skill to manage and navigate through a complex world and be a Karmayogi in the real sense. There's also a worldview competency along with the functional behavioral competencies. I would say at a vision level, there is also the ability to look at the big picture and then synthesize what that big picture means for us, maybe in public health, maybe in education. In each of the areas of public administration, what does the global complex world present to us as a challenge, and how do we deal with it? What is the paradigm? Now, if not just as a policy maker, but as a public policy analyst, or if I look at even as a learner, as a citizen, as a concerned parent, I try and look at the world, and the last week or so has presented to us two distinct challenges. You have on one side a movement, perhaps once in a century movement of science and technology, and a vision that humanity is now ready to explore interstellar civilization. We've also seen a very bold articulation of this in India's space mission, of course, backed by the tremendous success that we've had. But there is the frontier-breaking effort that's happening across the world. And we've seen this really brilliant image of the rocket launching and coming back and those giant metallic arms catching it back. So there is that vision that we are as a species now evolving to explore life outside of planet. But in the same week, we are also confronted with a very unpleasant and honestly unfair outcome of a total breakdown of a rules-based order where two very, very important nations, the relationships have soured simply because the leadership that's there has decided to use, in some ways, a subversion to retain power. That's the message that we're getting. So, for all of us who are looking at the world, the question is, if we are not able to come together as nations within this planet, how are we going to resolve this conflict, even if we were to discover life in any other planet? So, this comes to us even from the Western thinkers, very important contemporary philosopher, Daniel Schmachtenberger. He says it poignantly. He says, we are approaching the power of gods without the wisdom of gods. So the question of ethics, the question of culture, the question of knowledge systems, and knowledge systems that can harmonize the difference, and the question of being able to live with each other and respecting diversity in its true way is really urgent. It's not just a theoretical academic question. We're already in the midst of a global turmoil with 2 wars and a potential third one. We're also seeing, like I said, the really swift deterioration of a world order based on rules. And Jaishankarji had, in fact, called this out in one of his books. And this is, I think, the truth that every public policy analyst and public leader needs to countenance, that India's rise will be contested. And I'll explain this in a few slides. And he says this, and I quote, "A major rising power needs more than just accurate landscape analysis and the ability to act on it. It must, first of all, be confident of its own values and beliefs and base its policies on those convictions. And these convictions, these will draw from the totality of its culture, heritage, and traditions. The sum total of all that is Bharat, it has to start informing the policy as a lived tradition. And that is why India can only rise when it's truly, truly Bharat." So the context of Indian knowledge systems and having this conversation as part of Mission Karmayogi is not just a theoretical exercise. It's a very urgent vision that we are getting. And in fact, he goes on to explain the 5 dimensions that determine outcomes in a complex geopolitical landscape and a globalized world. If you look at the last 30, 40 years, geo-economic and geopolitical context is always known. But today, the same things that brought us together, whether it is technology, whether it is trade, whether it is travel, whether it is labor and capital mobility, and he points out that the same things that bring us together can also tear us apart. And that is happening because in 5 different dimensions, we are seeing rapid change. In globalization, especially post-COVID, we are talking about not just-in-time supply. We are actually moving from just-in-time to just-in-case. What happens if something breaks down? Nobody knows the answer right now. What is the optimal level of globalization where you can have supply chains optimized for, let's say, normal times, but they're also resilient and they are adaptive when something breaks down? So these words of resilience and adaptation are now becoming increasingly critical in public discourse. And that is directly linked to culture and knowledge systems. And if you think about ourselves, if we just allow ourselves to wonder that we are a 5,000-year-old civilization, if not more, the real number does not matter. But the fact that we've been together and we've seen so much of it together means that we have the lived experience of dealing with adversity. And all learning, like Sri Aurobindo said famously, all learning advances through strife. It is through adversity that we learn. So this is actually presently a phenomenal learning movement for the entire world. And that also leads to rebalancing of relationships between natures. We're also seeing multipolarity. It's not just a bipolar world. India definitely has a stake to be a major player in the world. And you cannot keep a country that is the third, fastest, the third biggest economy and perhaps the most populous one, and the fastest growing economy and a stable polity, maintaining macroeconomic sanity. You just cannot keep it outside of the world order. That is simply not tenable anymore. But as India comes into this, there will be some contestation, and that is what we are seeing. And all of this is compounded and amplified by technology. And of course, the old adage of games that nations play. Today, public policy and administration and governance, even in a local panchayat level, is critically linked to this because technology has radically networked society. So the way people mobilize and what they mobilize for is supplied by a global value chain. And that value chain runs on certain values and it uses technology to proliferate that. So when that happens at the local administration level as well, it is very critical to understand where motivations are being seeded. And that is really the question of knowledge systems. And we are going to see this play out in 4 critical dimensions: energy, ecology, economy, and ethics. All of human history is essentially the ability to convert one form of energy into another. Nature has done this to us with photosynthesis. We've done this with tool making. And what we call Industrial Revolution 4.0, right from, let's say, 16th, 17th century, is basically a discovery of new forms of energy that, in fact, is not something that we created. It is something that nature stored in the form of coal, in the form of fossil fuels. And we began exploring that using new tools. So suddenly there was availability of excess energy, and that propelled a host of human activity, also led to colonization. And we should also be very, very aware of that. But today, when we take stock of where we are with energy, especially as artificial intelligence is now seen as an important thing, artificial energy is not, AI is not energy compliant. So this whole quest for new planet is also a quest for new energy. In fact, today, what is called the energy rate of return, which is the unit that you spend as energy to unlock higher energy, the drilling that you do, the fracking that you do, that has gone from what used to be 1 to 500 ratio, which means that to get 500 ounces or 500 units of energy, you spend 1 or 2 units. Today, that has gone from 500 to less than 100. So all the global wars and everything else that we're going to see is a search for new energy security. And India particularly is importantly and delicately positioned because we are, this is our time of growth. And therefore, there is an energy demand. This explains why there is so much of skillful navigation by this leadership. On one side, dealing with the situation in Europe, dealing with the situation with US and our partners across the world to secure our energy needs while also playing an influential role for world peace. Energy clearly also has a link to ecology and that contest for How do you even frame sustainable development? This whole coinage also has to be relooked from an Indian perspective. How can we call development that is not sustainable development in the first place? What is development? And how do you then create sustainable development? So when you look at it from the idea of dharma, dharyate iti dharma, that which sustains is dharma, which is at the individual level, which is at the social level, which is at the planetary level. All of these things become a worldview and an ethical foundation for a new global future. But what is, why are we seeing this complexity, and what is the story that the world has of itself? With the fall of Russia and the end of Cold War, we had a unipolar world, let's say 1990. And Fukuyama famously at that time said that it is the end of history movement. He didn't mean, of course, that history will end in a literal sense, but he said that humanity has reached the pinnacle, that we finally have found the form of governance and organization that can be exported to the rest of the world, because this is really the best way, which is a combination of democracy, human rights, free markets, and mobility of labor. But there is another story to this, right? Within 30 years, and this is not just an India story, the greatest experiment that has happened in Europe post-World War II was the coming together of European Union to settle all of the historical civilizational differences, to come together as nations for peaceful coexistence. Similarly, the case with US. But in just 50 years or 60 years, we are seeing two seminal movements that have disrupted their own self-understanding. We've seen Brexit, which is seen by the young people in Europe increasingly as a vote against their future by the people who were elderly. And we're also seeing the rise of somebody who probably does not fit into either democratic or Republican values in their true sense. There is a true disruption that's going on. And so there is a search for meaning and identity in the Western world itself. And in the meantime, there is another rising superpower that we all need to acknowledge and contend with. And it has never happened in the history of civilizations that an existing superpower, which was US clearly at the end of Cold War, not just allowed, but also funded another power to rise to a great power status in just maybe 30 years. One, there is a churn for identity and therefore a churn of values going on in the West. At the same time, there is a new assertion that's coming to us from a new power. And India has the ability to add significant momentum. If we side with one of these ideas, then that side gets a lot of power. So a lot of what we see as even law and order challenges in India increasingly is actually a function of the games that are happening at a higher level, simply because of this phenomenon that nobody really seems to know where it will land. This leads us to, and this is there in the new book that has come up, Power Within as well. I picked it up from there, that there seem to be two different visions that are being offered to the world. Right? The Western investment in individual and saying that individual is supreme, and therefore what the future holds is the sovereign individual who will, by himself or herself, recognize the path to glory. That seems to be one paradigm of how do you radically empower the individual. On the other side, you also have the different, completely antithetical to the model that we got from end of Cold War in China, which is one party and a state party, and not really a democracy. It's state-led capitalism. So what is really the story for the world? Is it the sovereign individual, or is it the surveillance state? Or is there a third pole? Is there a dharma that we can supply? Is there a harmonization that we can attempt? And that needs to come from a different knowledge system altogether. It has to come from a civilization that has lived with complexity for some time. So that is where we are. And if you look at this, it's not just a question of interest if you are a strategist, but it is an existential issue. This has come out in some way before. I'm presenting the latest version of this. There was a survey done by organizations that are into sustainable development on what will happen if we were to scale up the lifestyle of one country to the rest of the world. Because that's what globalization really is. Globalization is not just a movement of trade and capital and labor. It's also a movement of tastes, preferences, attitudes, and culture. So when culture is exported, desires are also shaped in around that culture. So if we are shaping our desires around, let's say, an American way of life or a Britain way of life, so they did this data collection to understand which is the country or what happens if you scale the lifestyle to the entire world. If we were to scale up the lifestyle of UK today to the rest of the world, we will need 2.4 planet Earths. If you do that with South Korea, which is one of the rising economies in the world, you need almost 4 planets. With USA, it's almost 5. Right? And you see where this is going. There is only one significant nation where if the lifestyle is scaled up to the entire world, we can still remain within 1 planet. And that is India. And that must tell us something. It must tell us that there is something that people in this land discovered to have a purposeful, joyous life and coexist and be together without necessarily having to exceed the planetary boundaries. What is that? And that is really the intellectual and moral quest that we are on when we say Indian knowledge systems. But it's not just about a macro planetary issue. There is also another issue of meaninglessness. A lot of crises that we are seeing in the world today, the mental health epidemic, the confusion around existence, a lot of increase in surgeries, the whole idea of counseling in education, all of it tells us that there is something at a psychological level within the individual. This is also struggling. And if you examine that, there is a collective in crisis that comes from a human being's innate desire and need to belong. There is an identity crisis and I want to belong, but that desire to belong is now being captured using technology by competing ideologies. Somebody tells you are a right, somebody says you are a left, somebody says something else. This is basically contesting for the marketplace of mind. And when you have technology and power at that level doing that, it leads to a non-integral view of self. We are not able to identify ourselves fully with who we are. And this is where, when we talk about yoga, when we talk about Ayurveda, they're always grounded in integral view of self. Your physical self, your emotional self, your psychological self, and also your energy and social and interpersonal selves. When that is not offered, and particularly when it's amplified by exponential technology, you are getting culture wars. We've seen with Arab Spring how that has quickly become a law and order situation. We are seeing this increasingly in India. Some war somewhere in the world or some meme somewhere in the world begins, and suddenly you have entire society in another part of the world being animated about that and creating a law and order situation. And that is because there is a deep personal fissure which is then exploited by technology. And this is what Jaishankarji means when he says that the things that bring us together can also be weaponized to tear us apart. And this is also a public leader's responsibility today to understand what is happening. And different people have tried to articulate it differently and how to look at it. One way is multidisciplinary thinking. From the Western academics and thinkers and intellectuals as well, this has always been a primary perch, that you need to have integration of ideas across disciplines, science, arts, living systems, traditions, culture, all of these things. Life does not come to you as science or art. Conflict does not come to you as science or art. It comes to you as a whole. And the whole idea of learning is to be able to elevate yourself in a way that you're able to balance and manage whatever life presents you as an individual, as a society, as a nation, and hopefully as a global civilization as well. So this comes to us from complexity systems. If you look at the new articulation of artificial intelligence policy by Sanjeev Sanyalji and others, they are talking about a new approach to policy making itself, where they're saying you need to engage in not top-level planning, because in a complex world, you cannot plan everything. But do you have resilience and anti-fragility to deal with complexity? That your response is actually tuned to whatever emerges. And that is coming to us from the paradigm of complex systems. And we will look at how Indian knowledge systems looks at it. And then there is the idea of unity of knowledge and not compartmentalizing knowledge into buckets and looking at it from first principles. 5 seminal thinkers, for those who are interested in complexity thinking from the Western part of the world. Wilson, seminal scientist, and he has a great book and a concept called consilience, where he tried to unite all branches of knowledge from science, humanities, social sciences, and say that there is really unity in knowledge. Herbert Simon, who famously gave us the idea of bounded rationality, he talks about epistemic modesty, the willingness to learn, the willingness to be humble in face of complexity, and integration of physics, economics, artificial intelligence, psychology, all of this into one kind of coherent worldview. Buckminster Fuller is another very influential thinker on this. He draws from architecture, engineering, and natural systems. Charlie Munger, whose partner Warren Buffett is more famous perhaps, he gives us this metaphor, a very interesting metaphor, like a coat hanger, that you have a hanger which has some shelves, and you put different kind of coats on that. You put it from physics, you put it from biology, you put it from arts, you put it from economics, and you combine all of that to look at what is the first principle that you get. So all of these ideas have been there. And similarly, psychology, because it is the study of human nature, has also attempted to give us some understanding of this. In the Western world, and this has been the central problem because it began with a subject-object separation, particularly Freudian psychology, which went into analyzing the pathology of human behavior and normalizing it. What this means is that human behavior is both good and bad. And if you investigate only the bad, and if you amplify only the bad, you will say that and they went through this thing that all human depravity is because our desires are repressed. And they went into some kind of analysis with that. Jung tried to connect it with some kind of collective unconsciousness. Then you had Skinner, who give you the idea of human beings as just stimulus and response. Whatever is presented to us, we have a de facto response. Then they went into some kind of Eastern Indian idea of humanistic psychology. And only today, it is being called as the fourth wave in public policy. It's a very important new book by Michael Krishna, is a scholar at SOS London. He's come up with a book called A Theory for Everyone. And he frames public policy today as the fourth wave, which is a culture evolutionary behavioral paradigm of public policy. For the first time, they are talking about putting all these things together. And this is exactly what the Indian knowledge system has always done. And you're now hearing the need for a sacred cultural core in public policy. Examine the recent literature, particularly in ecology and public policy. You will see that all the efforts to change behavior and to make it sustainable is not working out. And that's not working out because the metaphysics or the idea of human nature is being given as just rational analysis for utility, that we are able to just maximize our benefit here by transacting. That is why they are increasingly looking at Eastern traditions, particularly Indian tradition, to see how did we deal with this question of human nature. And that is also why Mahabharata recognizes governance as the highest and most complex form, because it is in governance that the Yogakshema is of the entire collective, which means that it's an aggregate of all human natures that is controlled or that is given a direction to. So that brings us to the question of Bharata and what do we mean by Indian knowledge systems and how do we look at this challenge? If the world is indeed complex and one of the ways to deal with complexity is multidisciplinary thinking, what is our way? How have we done this? And is there something that we can offer to ourselves first and to the rest of the world when we look at this? And this is not, it doesn't need a separate articulation, because if you look at policy making, particularly in the last 10 years, you look at mission life, you look at the policy of Vishwakarma, all of these policies are drawing from very, very deep resources within the Indian civilizational collective wisdom. And that is why they are popular. There is a reason why there is such tremendous public support, because it speaks the aspirations of the people of this land and the values that they carry de facto. But a formal way of classifying what we call Indian knowledge systems, for those who are looking at this the first time, it's essentially literary and non-literary. This is very important for all thinkers to cognize, because the Indian culture is oral primarily. A lot of our wisdom is in the parables. Har ek bhasha mein hai ye. Every language has its own idioms, phrases. That is really the distilled essence of the wisdom. So it's not just the textual tradition, but the lived tradition, the folk tradition, the tribal tradition, the lived exchange that people have, all of this. So there is literary, and you have both religious, art, philosophy, all of this is there. In the formal classification, this is called Chaturdasha Vidyasthana, 14 elements of our knowledge system, which come to us both as sciences and arts. But the beauty of this is that there was no artificial separation of knowledge as science or art or humanities or social sciences. In fact, one of the greatest texts, and this is the moment of wonder once you get into it, one of the greatest texts of mathematics, Leelavati in India, and some of you might be aware of this already, is composed as poems. Everything in the Indian literature, if you look at look at Yoga Sutra, you look at Artha Shastra, it comes to you in the form of aphorism, a small couplet. All of us are familiar with Kabir ke dohe. So there is not just the knowledge, but also some kind of pedagogy that is able to explain this in an integral way. Once you begin to see this, you see three kinds of pedagogies in the Indian knowledge system. So there is the knowledge content, which is the 14 areas. Some classify it as 18, some classify it as 15, but it includes everything from applied science, engineering, technology, architecture, chemistry, alchemy, aesthetics, health, wellness, psychology, public administration, wealth of religious literature, all of that. When you look at it, you get three kind of pedagogies. The first one is called Prabhu Samhitam, which is the principles or the conceptual understanding for the king. Then you have the Mitra Samhitam. That is, consider that the formal Shastra method. Then you have the Mitra Samhitam, because learning is best done when we exchange and when we meet each other as friends, when we are able to have a fluent conversation. Itihasa Purana is basically that. India's greatest export has been this tradition and this corpus of knowledge through stories. In fact, if you look at it, the first creative leap in storytelling, where what we call anthropomorphic, where animals start getting human characters and human predicaments and human challenges, is actually Panchatantra. And Panchatantra is one of the most widely read books all over the world. It is one book or one work that has inspired civilizations across the world, from Aesop's fables to what you see in Saudi Arabia, all of that. This idea that you have other beings drawing on human concerns and through that learning was one of the greatest creative leaps in the world. And that is what enabled Indian storytelling tradition. If you go to Southeast Asia today, and this government has been particularly emphasizing on relationship with Southeast Asia, because we have shared roots, we have a shared culture. And culture transfer happens when you have these story forms. So the second pedagogy that comes to us from Indian knowledge system, which can alter our neurology to become more okay with learning, is coming to us from the idea of Itihasa Purana. And last one is what we call Kavya Shastra, or it is called the Kanta Samhitam, which means that something of beauty, something aesthetic. When we connect with it, then we actually learn faster. So in learning in the Indian civilization, Indian knowledge systems, you have three ways to approach it. You can learn at a conceptual level, you can learn at a story level, and you can also learn at an aesthetic level. Natya Shastra begins with that concern. All of these are extraordinary opportunities. And lastly, we must frame this as the development of full human potential using our knowledge systems. We've heard of multiple intelligences. Those who are in education probably have seen Howard Gardner and Ken Wilber. In fact, all of those were actually inspired by Sri Aurobindo's works in many ways. But we must look at our knowledge tradition as intelligences that we can foster, and particularly in young minds, particularly in education, particularly in culture. How do we imbibe these intelligences in our own selves? If you look at Natya Shastra, it is an entire text much before poetics even was coined as a word, or semiotics was coined. The aesthetic intelligence. Similarly, if you look at Tarka Shastra, the idea of argumentation in Indian tradition, we look at so much of public discourse today, and it is so violent. But in the Indian tradition, if a debater loses patience, if a debater shows signs of anger, he or she was seen as weak. Because if you're making your point, there's no need for anger. So Tarka Shastra is the logical cognitive intelligence. Similarly, the idea to know yourself. What are the states of your mind? We are talking about self-awareness. One of the first competencies that I see in Karmayogi is self-awareness. How can we improve our self-awareness? What is the text? What is the method? What is the way? And that comes to us from Yoga Sutra, which is both practice and theory. That is the deep psychological intelligence that we can access. Similarly, for public communication and understanding the importance of word and sound, nama rupa, because everything in the world in the Indian tradition is seen as nama rupa. That's why we have this idea of Shabda Brahman. And if you look at it that way, the linguistic intelligence comes to us from a text called Astadhyayi, particularly the Dhatu part. So if all of these intelligences, then how do we come together as a society? What are human predicaments when you have lot of different kinds of cultures coming together? Europe talks about multiculturalism. The socio-cultural intelligence comes to us from Itihasa Purana. The more we go into Ramayana, the more we go into Mahabharata or any other Purana, any other text in the civilization, you see that they are actually revealing the collective concerns that we have, the three eternal pursuits of identity, stability, and prosperity, and how governance or how Raja Dharma has to secure that. This is the true lesson that we get from Indian knowledge systems. And if you look at it, we can conceptualize this at three levels. You can conceptualize it at global, you can conceptualize this at national and individual levels. And I will just leave everyone with three frameworks, which in fact have already been articulated in some kind of policy language, particularly in mission life, but we can go deeper into it. At the global planetary level, it is an element of what we call the Pancha Mahabhutas, Akasha, Prithvi, Agni, Jala, Vayu. There is enormous literature and practice in this land around living with these five elements. For those who are deep into Ayurveda, you probably know that your fundamental nature is, which is again Pancha Mahabhutas, because everything is based on that. That is why some treatment might, involve you sitting by water. Some treatment might ask you, this was very famous, a few years ago when Honorable Prime Minister spoke about walking barefoot on earth. It's actually a deep Ayurvedic and yogic practice that you feel the Prithvi. Similarly, for focus, for public leaders who need to focus an intense kind of activity, in Ayurveda, there is a practice called Trataka, where you watch the flame for a few moments every day and you start getting automatically into an altered state of consciousness. Similarly, with the wind, we are now seeing a lot of alternate healing about how sound travels through air. Right? This is now form of some kind of therapy. All of these are available to us if we can blend this into policy making. If we are able to think, how does every policy interact with environment? What does it do to Akasha? Today, we are, just yesterday I was reading a report that world scientific body has said that for the first time in the history of humanity, our water composition has changed. And it means that it's directly linked to what's happening with soil and trees. So all of these are fundamental concerns of policy, which means we need to learn about interacting with elements in a very, very new way, but going back to some of the corpus and experience that we have. Similarly, for the desha, for the nation, if you look at it as a nation, in the Indian conception, it has always been conceptualized as a living organism. It's not just an entity, a land. S. Radhakrishnan, I think, has said it famously, that a nation is not just a caprice of earth that is just thrown around. It is a living thing. If you look at the five sheaths, what is called the kosha is just a sheath, and Taittiriya Upanishad and other knowledge systems in Indian tradition talk about how we are, which is the fundamental truth. We have a gross body of Annamaya Kosha, the most fundamental element of actually living. Then you have Pranamaya, which is your energy. In the political sense, it's mapped to political leadership. Then you have Manomaya. Both the food and prana are to make you feel good so that you can pursue what is called Purushartha. That is given as a Manomaya Kosha. But you also need Vijnanamaya to actually go towards knowledge and wisdom. And finally, it is in the Indian conception that you have the deepest exploration of Ananda. And it is not just mere joy. There are different gradients of Ananda that yoga talks about, that Vedanta talks about. So this, in fact, today, there is a new paradigm in national security or new sort of argument in national security because of technology and how technology is weaponized. Cognitive security is national security. How we think and what is influencing how we think is the architecture of national security. So that is the way we can conceptualize a nation. At an individual and social level, the Indian tradition gives us 5 debts that all of us are born with and that we need to repay. And this repaying of debt is the real equality, because that is the way for contentment in a society. And that is the Manushya Rina, the Rina that we have to each other as people. It doesn't matter what race, religion, caste, region that we are. We have a debt that we need to pay to each other. The Rishi Rina, people who've given you knowledge in your own tradition, whatever the tradition is. And then your own ancestors, whose genes that you carry, and your own gods, to make sure that you look at nature as also one of the elements. And then all the five elements of nature, the Panchabhuta Rana. In the Indian tradition, the way to think of development is enabling individual to repay these five debts, which is the path to contentment. So in that context, the only way that we can do this is, we talk about learning organization. All of us are probably familiar with Peter Singe's theory. I think what is happening this week is the genesis of a true leadership legacy, which is a learning state. We talk about 5 principles and 5 states there. But I think something like this, where the entire state is becoming an enabler of learning for complex futures. And if that can be combined with Indian knowledge systems, I think we have nothing that can stop us from being at least the enabler of a better world. Thank you. I'm open for questions now.
Thank you so much, Raghavji, for this very insightful and excellent way of presenting to us. The frameworks that you put out also brings up to mind that we can actually present Indian knowledge systems in a very organized, structured, and evidential way, and also make it a very practical tool for our existence. So one question which I see online, which I'm going to ask, and then that gives some time for Ankit to put together the other questions and aggregate them, is one question which has come up is very interesting. It comes from one of your slides. And that question says, scaling the lifestyle scales that you showed us. The question is that if India's lifestyle requires only 0.7 Earths, what does India need to do so that the aspiration of Vikasit Bharat actually sustains and maintains that? And we still achieve Vikasit Bharat in the complete sense of the word.
Fantastic. No, I think this is the central question that is there for policymakers. And Ananta Nageshwaranji recently also spoke about this, particularly in the context of artificial intelligence. We are having a challenge where you have a very large population that is your strength because it's in the working age and can be productive. But you're also going through a global trend where work is increasingly being done by technology. And that means it's a capital-centric structure. But India needs a labor-centric structure as well to balance. And how do you balance both these things so that there is both fulfillment and also growth? So the question that we have in front of us, and what is the right fiscal policy for that? But it's also a question of contentment. It's a question of conceptualizing development in our own terms. Today, if you look at the world critically from our perspective, being rooted, US is at 60K per capita, and we are seeing what's happening in the politics in US. Like I said, there is a huge churn, and there is a divorce rate that I think has capped 50%. There is a mental health crisis that has increased manifold in the last 10 years. There is an opioid crisis. So clearly, if you take the experience of the Western world, and particularly the superpower in US, you notice that material prosperity alone does not seem to always sanction joy or lead to joy. So what is the alternate conception of growth and development, which is what leading to that 0.7? And the Indian tradition has been about Purushartha. Purushartha is the fourfold pursuit of human life, which is Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. And I think the secret is in the way our tradition has folded that. It didn't say Artha, Kama, Dharma, Moksha. It didn't say Kama, Artha, Dharma, Moksha. It put Dharma as first because that is the harmonizing principle. Dharma, Artha, Kama. Nothing is denied. Pursuit of wealth and well-being is natural. That is human. Pursuit of sensual desire is human. That has to be enabled. Pursuit of aesthetic pleasure. Yeah. Pursuit of aesthetic pleasure is also genuine. The Indian tradition never denied this. So I think the first thing that needs to happen is a thorough understanding of this principle of dharma, which is what we get. Ultimately, the sum total of all the texts is the idea of dharma. So we need to engage deeply with this idea of dharma, which is basically, I'm a student of ecology, and the most interesting work on this is happening from an organization in UK called R3.0, And they have this idea of GTAC, global thresholds and allocations, which basically means when we are introducing a policy or when you're introducing a new technology, you look at the environment and the carrying capacity of that environment. The environment has certain boundaries inbuilt, and you define the thresholds. And within the thresholds, you allocate whatever externalities your intervention is producing. And you also make sure that those externalities are computed back into the way you're looking at development. If, for example, if we say we are drilling an oil well, which we need to for energy, like I said, that is the play. You also understand within that environment, what is the externality it is producing, how much of urban waste, how much of natural wealth it is. And you say that the GDP calculation also has a bottom line where this is factored. So therefore, your consciousness is shaped that it is not a linear story of progress. It is actually a complex, complicated, multidisciplinary way of thinking. And this multidisciplinary way of thinking is the Indian way in Dharma. Dharma basically is understanding what are the boundary constraints for everything. And this comes to us not just from a theory alone, this comes to us from our own experience. If we don't sleep well, if you use technology too much, if you don't manage our health well, this is not maintaining the Swadharma, because your body has a certain energy. So this is how the Indian mind has looked at it. There are theories and conceptions that we can go into. But at a high level, the answer is understanding Dharma as a complexity thinking for calculating thresholds.
So much. Thank you so much, Raghavji. Ankit, if you can, the questions have been aggregated. If you can start asking them, we still only have 8 or 9 minutes left. So quickly, if you can ask them, and Raghav can make quick answers also. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Raghavji, for your insight so far. So one question which audience is asking is the impact of Indian knowledge system easier to note and implement in science, or things which can be created with grandeur or showcased with grandeur? Something you also already mentioned, but how do we ensure that it reaches the local administration level to maintain the motivation of the last mile worker?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is critical. And it is not, I think the way we conceptualize is not that there is a knowledge dissemination from above. That is not the Indian way at all. And I also clarified that in the definition itself. Indian knowledge system, in fact, spatially, if you look at it, it is cosmopolitan, the city knowledge, then what is called the folk knowledge, which is the village knowledge, and then what is called the Vana. Nagara, Grama, Vana is the way Indian mind looks at it. The Vana is the tribal knowledge system. All human experience with nature and coming together is knowledge. That comes out orally, that comes out textually, that comes out as a song, that comes out as a practice. First thing to do is actually learn from the society what is the way that they are living. And this has been done. I recently saw Mission Poshan, for example. There was a book that DRI published, the Ministry of Health, I think, where they looked at the songs that people sing while they are harvesting. And there is deep connection to nature and deep understanding of what to be done when and how to be distributed. So that is a way of actually, taking knowledge from the society to feed into policymaking. So it's a two-way process, that there is something that we need to formalize and bring into policy, but that has to be nourished and informed first by what we are observing. And for that, language is critical. And that is why the importance of new education policy and what we're talking about as Bharatiya Bhasha, because all of our wisdom and knowledge is encoded in language. Language is the highest abstraction humans have made. And that is why language, both for public administration, for education and culture, is very, very critical. So examining that and then bringing it into policy making automatically gives the people a feeling that they are part of this co-creation. So then this last mile question does not arise, because we are also picking it up from, we are giving back what is already there, right? So that's, I think, the right way. Of course, I'm not trying to simplify this. There are many, many challenges, socio-economic, all of these challenges are there. But sometimes it is about an inspiration from a new paradigm that can give new action.
Thank you, Raghavji. I think my next question, partly you gave some direction already to it in the previous response, but you already talked about the frameworks, Panch Mahabhutas, Panch Kosh, and Panch Rin.
Yeah.
What is one thing, or even if multiple, as an individual policy maker, what can I do to ensure personal and collective well-being, and also extend it to building resilience and anti-fragility to be able to navigate complexity? Where do I begin?
I think just calculating dharma quotient in policy is already one way. But also think about it as experiences that we need to create. What do humans crave for? The Indian conception is ananda, right? And we can combine this into 5 experiences that every policy must create and policymaker must create in culture. The first one is some kind of performative experience. And my friend Shivkumar talks about this. But fundamentally, it is that humans want to perform something. They want to have an agency, right? So there is in policymaking, what is the kind of performance that you're creating? If you look at Vishwakarma as a policy and the articulation that Prime Minister has done, it is respecting the actual performances that people have done for their own kulavrittis and making that an aspirational thing, right? Similarly, there is some consumption. Through every performance, you also consume something. So what is it that you can create as an experience that they get back? That is one way. Third, and very critical, is ritual experience. It's very, very important, particularly in ancient societies like Bharat, that you have some kind of collective coming together, which is why, all of the outreach that happens is very critical, because you're coming together and there is a shift in consciousness and there's a harmony. Fourth, which probably we need to increase, and I don't think we do a good job currently, is the aesthetic experience. The true bliss is when there is something of beauty. Can policy making and policy interaction also have some elements of beauty in it, which can come from our knowledge system? There is a whole theory to it. And we can engage our artists, we can engage people who perform arts for this. And finally, which is only there in the Indian tradition as far as I know today, is the sacrificial or the what we call the vrata ritual. In the Indian mind, also because of ashrama system, where you have to consume and then let go. This letting go is critical for global futures. And the experience has to be created renunciation. This you can see when Prime Minister Modi gave the call for Give It Up campaign. It resonates naturally with the Indian mindset, because the idea of Tyaga and Seva is a deeply Indian one. And we want to seek that, because that is the goal that life has set for us, that you need to consume in the ashramas, produce, and then you give it up and move on to higher goals. So creating these experiences as part of policymaking can be one creative way of looking at how do you engage.
I think we have time for one more question, Ankit, because we have 2 minutes left, and a quick question, maybe a quick answer from Raghava, and then I can.
Yeah, I'll just maybe keep it to one line.
Yes. So, given that we started our week with such deep thoughts, what are few of the sources which learners can probably refer to, maybe 1 or 2, if someone is more curious?
Sure. We have on our website, and it's not a plug, I'm just saying this because it's there, on bruhat.in, brhat.in, we have something called Bruhat Open Library, where we curate all of our civilizational knowledge corpus in different ways. IKS is one. Somebody who wants to learn about history, it's there. Somebody who wants to learn about Puranas, all the Puranas are digitized and stored. There are, of course, many, many government libraries also, but we try and curate it in interesting ways. I can share the link, Ankit, later, and if there is a way to send it out, that can be one. But the great thing today is that there is no restriction. This knowledge is available to us. There is deep interest. Just yesterday, one last statement. Ayurveda, I was with a senior Ayurveda practitioner who's with Apollo, and he said 70% of people who are turning to Ayurveda are between the age of 25 and 35. It is our young people who are now looking at our knowledge system. You go to temples, you see so many young people who are coming. You go to any sacred, you look at yoga, you look at all of this. People are seeking this, and the knowledge is available. And I think through this initiative, I hope it reaches everyone. Our vision is within the next 15 years, no child in India should pass through education without being acquainted to our knowledge corpus, the Yoga Sutra, the Natya Shastra. Everybody should experience harmony and beauty with this island.
That's a great way to conclude, Raghavji, and it was a wonderful 1 hour that we all had. So much of insights into how actually we can combine the world of public policy, Indian knowledge systems, and actually make it practical and applicable. Normally, as people, teachers and students of policy think that it was Laswell who actually organized public policy into a system and brought it to the world. And that was only in the 50s. But what we have in India is centuries old, and you sort of brought it out so beautifully and evidentially. And I'm sure as we strengthen Mission Karmayogi and take learning to be a lifelong pursuit of people, these concepts will be embedded in the thinking of our policymakers. And I once again thank you, and I thank all the participants, attendees from all over the country for having joined us today. These webinars will be available to you as video recordings on the IGOT platform. You can again go again and view it. My suggestion to all the ministries and other officials watching this was to repeat what Honorable Prime Minister told in the Learning Week speech of his, where we make this a community event. We discuss these issues discussed here. We talk amongst ourselves during breaks that we take and ask ourselves, how do we embed this knowledge in our ministries functioning, in our personal functioning, to build a great Bharat. With this, inviting you all to join a very exciting next webinar where we are going to have technologists, become names known all over the world. Nandan Nilekani and Shankar Marwada will be talking about it. And later on today, we have another very exciting Indian Knowledge Systems webinar. So again, asking you to spread this message, participate, and make this Festival of Learning a great success. Thank you again, all of you.
Thank you.